If I ask you how many villains appeared in Batman Begins, you'd probably think of these two right away, Ra's al Ghul and Scarecrow. We all know that these two classic villains were the main antagonists of the movie, but a lot of people don't know that there's a third minor comic book villain in the movie hidden in plain sight. You're maybe thinking about Carmine Falcone, the mob boss that Batman took out during the first half of the movie, but I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about this guy, who's actually Victor Zsasz, a pretty underrated villain from Batman's Rogues Gallery who definitely deserves to be more popular than he is. He was portrayed as a mob enforcer and assassin for Carmine Falcone, who gets put on trial and locked away in Arkham, only for him to escape later in the movie. And we can actually confirm that he is indeed meant to be Zsasz, because during some shots we can see his characteristic scars just like he has in the comics. Because for those of you who don't know, Victor Zsasz is actually a serial killer that carves a tally mark so that it'll leave a scar for every time that he kills someone, just to keep count of all his victims. He's one of Batman's most sadistic and violently unhinged villains, who definitely deserves to be showcased more in a future adaptation where they could show how insanely violent he truly is. So while it's a shame that he had such a minor role in Batman Begins, it's still really cool that he was included at all. And years later, he would also be included as a secondary villain in Birds of Prey. Victor Zsasz is only one of many secret comic book villains who appear as minor characters or cameos in Batman movies. There's a lot of characters that appeared in his films that a lot of people might have not realized that they were actually adaptations of characters from the comics. Another example from Batman Begins would be Henri Ducard. That's the name that Liam Neeson uses to introduce himself to Bruce Wayne, and it's actually a reference to a character from the comics. Henri Ducard was a French detective who mentored Bruce while he was traveling in Paris. Ducard trained Bruce in how to manhunt and track down criminals, but they would later have a falling out in the comics because Ducard is a mercenary that has no problem in killing people and working with criminals, something that stands against Bruce's principles. Of course, during Batman Begins, it was later revealed that this character wasn't actually Henri Ducard. He was shown to be Ra's al Ghul, and while Ducard didn't truly show up in the film, I do hope that he gets fully adapted in the future, or maybe they could adapt Ducard's son, Nobody, another mercenary that was trained by his father alongside Bruce, and I'd actually love for Nobody to be the main villain of The Brave and the Bold. Since in the comics, he has an awesome storyline where he tries to corrupt Damian Wayne into turning against his father. Both Ducard and Nobody are underrated characters that have a personal connection to Bruce Wayne, and while he didn't technically appear in Batman Begins, I still find it really cool that Ducard was even mentioned at all. Another obscure villain that people speculate appeared in Batman Begins is Ubu, who's Ra's al Ghul's right-hand man in the comics. And there's rumors that the fake decoy Ra's al Ghul, played by Ken Watanabe, was actually meant to be playing Ubu. Although this has never been officially confirmed, and if we're being real, people probably only think this because they're both bald. There's another awesome hidden comic book villain in the Dark Knight trilogy, where we actually see him way before the character would become an enemy of Batman. And I'm talking about him. That little kid is actually James Gordon Jr., Commissioner Gordon's first son, who would actually go on to become one of Batman's most dangerous and mentally unhinged villains, who's done awful things like torturing and killing young children and targeting his own sister. In the comics, writers have proposed that James Gordon Jr. began developing violent and psychopathic tendencies since childhood, and it's theorized that he was greatly affected after he was kidnapped and almost killed by some mobsters working under Carmine Falcone during the Year One storyline. And it's thought that this early near-death experience is supposed to have deeply traumatized James so much that it negatively shaped his entire personality and behaviors, later beginning to torture animals and show really violent antisocial attitudes as he grew older. eventually becoming one of Gotham's most dangerous serial killers, and it's kinda crazy to think that technically, we might have seen an adaptation of James Gordon Jr.'s origin story during the finale of The Dark Knight. Given that, similar to the comics, in the film, he was also kidnapped and his life was threatened by Two-Face, who would later die in front of him fighting against Batman. So maybe, in the Dark Knight universe, James Gordon Jr. became deeply traumatized by this experience in the movie, and he also later became a serial killer in that world. But we'll never truly know, especially since James Jr. didn't even appear in The Dark Knight Rises, so it's a mystery what ended up happening to him in the Dark Knight universe. And speaking of The Dark Knight Rises, that movie introduced a businessman character that was attempting to take over control of Wayne Enterprises, called John Daggett. And ever since I've seen the movie, I've always thought that he was meant to be Roland Daggett, another evil businessman that was a recurring villain on Batman the Animated Series. But unfortunately, there's no confirmation on whether or not John Daggett was meant to be an adaptation or homage to that character. But I personally think that his last name was very much intentional. After Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy ended, we saw a new Batman interpretation in the DCEU. And while we didn't get to see that version of the character get his own solo movie, he did have a team-up movie with Superman in Dawn of Justice. And during that movie, we actually got to see an obscure Batman enemy get adapted as a minor villain. Actor Colin Mulvey, who worked alongside Zack Snyder in the past on 300, also had a role in Batman v Superman as a Russian mercenary working for Lex Luthor, who is actually an adaptation of KGBeast, an assassin from the DC universe that works as a mercenary for a branch of the KGB called the Hammer. He frequently fights against Batman in the comics, and despite him not appearing in with his costume and having a pretty minor role in BVS, he was still important to the film's plot, given that he was responsible for the scene in the beginning of the film where he's killing people in Africa and framing it to look like it was done by Superman, putting the general public against him. He even kidnapped Martha.
I'll kill her! Believe me, I'll do it!
I believe you.
Overall, there were actually a number of Batman villains that were included or planned to be included in the DC Extended Universe. As mentioned previously, we never got to see a solo Batman movie in the DCEU, but there were plans to make one. And during the mid-2010s, Warner had announced The Batman with Ben Affleck directing and starring. Writer Chris Terrio had done a screenplay where Deathstroke would have targeted Batman since Deathstroke blames him for his son's death. And after Lex Luthor reveals to him that Bruce Wayne is Batman, he would have attempted to ruin his life. Alfred would have been killed, and Batman would be trapped inside Arkham Asylum, with Batman having to escape the asylum in a The Raid-style inspired action movie as Batman progresses through the asylum's many different levels, so we also would have likely seen many other villains from his rogues gallery as well. Eventually, Ben Affleck would drop as the director of the movie, Matt Reeves would be hired as his replacement, and eventually, we would get the Batman that we all know and love in 2022, completely disconnected to the DCEU. But I still think that the original plot for the movie is pretty cool, and we did get to see Joe Manganiello as the DCEU's Deathstroke during Justice League's post-credits scene, and its epilogue set in the Nightmare timeline. Another Batman villain that was roaming around the DCEU behind the scenes was the Riddler. During Batman v Superman, there's a scene that shows the Riddler's question mark symbol, and the Riddler's shirt is hung in the Batcave, a prop from the movie which was later sold in an auction in 2019. And the character was meant to appear in other movies within the DCEU. He was meant to appear in Ben Affleck's version of the Batman, and also in the original sequel plans for Zack Snyder's Justice League, since he would have appeared as a part of Lex Luthor's Injustice League, and Lex would have forced him to study the anti-life equation. Also, Peacemaker Season 1, which was set in the DCEU, actually name-dropped the Riddler as well as Mad Hatter, confirming that both villains exist somewhere in the DCEU.
Batman has a coterie of supervillains. Joker, Riddler, Mad Hatter.
So what?
So I think it's pretty cool to know that even though Batman v Superman wasn't fully a Batman movie, it still had minor inclusions of Batman villains. Elsewhere in the DCEU, Black Mask appeared in Birds of Prey alongside Victor Zsasz as mentioned previously. Killer Croc was a main character in 2016 Suicide Squad alongside Deadshot, who are both Batman villains. And a cool detail about the movie is that in Amanda Waller's top secret files that briefly appear in the film mention the existence of the Penguin. Its sequel, The Suicide Squad, included adaptations of a few obscure Batman villains. Ratcatcher 2 and Polka Dot Man were both main members of Task Force X. And Calendar Man had a brief cameo. He was played by Sean Gunn and had a design reminiscent of his long Halloween look. Another villain we actually almost got to see during 2016 Suicide Squad, but was scrapped, was Scarecrow. He was considered to be included as a member of the team, but they didn't choose him in the end. There was even concept art made showing how he could have looked like in the film. And speaking about Scarecrow, did you know that rapper Coolio had a cameo in Batman and Robin? I swear to God, this is related, because during a brief scene in Batman and Robin, Coolio appears during a street race between one of Gotham's gangs, and years later, in 2017, during an interview, Coolio revealed that he had been approached by Joel Schumacher to potentially play Scarecrow during the planned sequel, Batman Unchained. Nicolas Cage was also considered to play Scarecrow in a plot that would have involved him teaming up with Harley Quinn, who would have been portrayed as the daughter of Jack Nicholson's Joker and potentially would have been played by Madonna. So even though Coolio didn't end up being Scarecrow in the Burton-Schumacher universe, it's still weird as hell that he showed up in Batman and Robin. Another minor character that appeared in Batman and Robin, who most people might have not realized that he was a DC supervillain from the comics, was Dr. Jason Woodrue, the scientist who worked alongside Pamela Isley and who ended up manipulating her into becoming Poison Ivy. This is a loose adaptation of Secret Origins number 36, where Poison Ivy's backstory also shows her as a student under Jason Woodrue, who in the comics is actually a full-on supervillain himself called the Floronic Man, a scientist that develops a formula that transforms him into a plant-humanoid hybrid. What I find kind of funny is that Jason Woodrue has been adapted in live action twice, once in Batman and Robin, and once again years later during the failed Swamp Thing show from the DC Universe streaming app. And that show actually ended on a cliffhanger where they finally teased Jason's transformation into the Floronic Man. But the series was unfortunately cancelled, even though it was really good. This is how the character's design would have looked like in a potential season 2, and the Floronic Man was also going to be used as the villain in Guillermo del Toro's Justice League Dark planned movie that he was developing during the early 2010s and potentially would have been set in the DCEU. So while he appeared only as Dr. Woodrue in Batman and Robin, it's still awesome that the Floronic Man has technically already made his live-action cinematic debut. On the topic of minor characters from the Burton-Schumacher universe that we didn't get to see them transform into their supervillain personas, an infamous unseen villain from the franchise was Billy D. Williams' Two-Face. During the 1989 Batman movie, Harvey Dent had a minor role in the film that was setting him up to become Two-Face in a future sequel. Something that was talked about from the very beginning with Tim Burton. In the '89 movie, he was portrayed by Billy D. Williams and was shown as Harvey Dent working as a district attorney of Gotham and cooperating with the GCPD in order to bring down the city's mob bosses and later on the Joker. And while both Tim Burton and Billy D. Williams had discussions and were interested in Williams reprising his role as Dent in a future sequel, with both actually wanting to see him become Two-Face, unfortunately, he had only signed a contract for one movie, so if Warner really wanted to get Williams to play Harvey Dent once again, they would have had to rehire him for a new movie. And given that after the mixed reception of Burton's Batman Returns, Warner Brothers was already changing visions by hiring a new director, Joel Schumacher. They also most likely were more interested in trying to get a more popular Hollywood star rather than rehiring Billy D. Williams, since they weren't even tied to him contractually. So in the end, Tommy Lee Jones played Harvey Dent and Two-Face in Batman Forever. So even though we did eventually ended up seeing Harvey Dent in that film continuity, we never got to see the Billy D. Williams version of the character. However, a few years back in 2021, DC Comics released Batman 89, a limited comic book miniseries illustrated by Joe Quinones and written by Sam Hamm, who is actually the original screenwriter for both the 89 Batman movie and Returns. So this comic actually includes reworkings of some of the ideas that they had if Tim Burton had actually made more Batman sequels, showing the return of Catwoman, the debut of Robin, and also the transformation of Harvey Dent into Two-Face. The series is set sometime after Returns, depicting how Gotham is being hit by a series of attacks and fires started by street gangs inspired by the Joker and Batman. So in response to this, Harvey Dent starts a campaign to finally arrest Batman, and later on in the story, after a fire in a motor shop was started by a Batman gang member, Harvey Dent had half of his face burned, much like in The Dark Knight, and he was actually contaminated by battery acid entering his face. Later, they would show Harvey's continuing declining mental state and his decay into Two-Face, which has an absolutely awesome design. It kinda takes inspiration from Batman the Animated Series' minimalist black and white suit, while combining it with some Tim Burton influence. I really love it, and I did enjoy Batman 89 overall. So as we can see, Batman movies are filled with details, and there's always a lot more background to seemingly small characters. Some comic book villains were only mentioned but confirmed to exist within the movies while remaining unseen, and other villains were actually hidden in plain sight, with a lot of people watching these movies without ever realizing stuff like Lex Luthor's mercenary actually being a costumed villain from the comics, or that Commissioner Gordon's son grows up to be an insane serial killer. But that's some of the fun in watching these movies. That's fun.